for the information there, plus using that at field day this year. And then Roy gets here after Chris finishes up, we'll get into some of the field day prep kind of stuff.
All right, thanks, Tim. The motivation for tonight's presentation is this year at Field Day we're going to attempt to operate digital modes for the first asterisk time. We actually attempted to operate some digital on 6 meters last year and had an issue with the sound card interface and weren't able to do it. This year we're planning to have digital capability on at least 3, maybe 4 stations. Who in here had heard of FT8 before it was mentioned at the club meeting at the beginning of the month? About half the room. It's kind of hard to have not heard at least something about FT8 since it was introduced in July of 2017. What I'm going to do tonight is start out by just talking about digital modes in general. What is a digital mode? What are some of the digital modes in amateur radio? What are they used for? What do they sound like? Sort of a where have we come from, and then we're going to talk about where we are now. So, what is a digital mode? A digital mode is any modulation scheme where information is sent using discrete values. We typically think of that meaning ones and zeros. It could be, it could go beyond that. It could be, each symbol could represent more than just 2 values. But the idea is it's discrete as opposed to a continuously varying analog signal like voice, AM, FM, sideband, whatever. Those are analog signals. Some of the modulation schemes that are used for digital: frequency shift keying, where you transmit tones of different frequencies. It can be 2 tones, 4 tones, or many tones, depending on the specific digital mode that is being used. Frequency shift keying, when you just say frequency shift keying by itself, typically you're talking about 2 different tone frequencies, like with radio teletype. If it's more than 2, we typically use the term MFSK for multi-frequency shift keying. For example, MFSK 16 is a digital mode that uses 16 tones to transmit information. And then there's also phase shift keying, or PSK. If you've ever heard of PSK 31, that's a mode that it transmits 1 tone frequency, but it flips the phase back and forth to indicate changes in the data, actual data values. So we'll hear examples of all those. I'll talk more about those here shortly. What is not a digital mode? Slow scan TV, generally speaking, is not a digital mode. Yes, there is digital slow scan television, but the traditional SSTV modes, Robot, Scotty, all of those are analog. It's a continuously varying tone that transmits information about color and has a sync pulse for each line, and there's really not a whole lot digital about it. I'll have to break for you here at some point because this is kind of lengthy. Fax, analog fax as used on HF radio is very, very similar to slow scan TV. Again, it's usually black and white. You're representing a gray level with the frequency of your audio tone. Hellschreiber is a digital mode that actually prints characters out on your screen. It's like it's a lot like fax. And there's always this debate. There are some people who like to say CW is the original digital mode. And I feel that that's a debatable assertion. Because CW, yes, there are 2 states, on or off, on-off keying, but you've got a variable length code, and it's kind of debatable as to whether it's really digital. The FCC does not consider it digital. It's really a matter of semantics. I keep using the wrong computer. So now I want to go through sort of the history of digital modes in amateur radio. That will take us from actually the 20s and 30s all the way through to the present, and it's not going to be exhaustive. There will be things that I leave out. but I'll try to hit the highlights as we go. So the original true digital mode was radio teletype. Radio teletype is based on military technology that actually prototypes of it were developed in the 20s. It really started to be used in the 30s. Ham use of RIDI began after World War II. There were some experiments done on VHF with it in 1949, but it was not legalized by the FCC until 1953. But this is the mode where people take the old teletype machines, interface it with some sort of modem, and then to a radio, and as they type on the teletype, it converts the baud code of the teletype into two audio tones that go out over the air. Somebody on the other end decodes that, and it prints out on their teletype machine. 170 hertz shift, the two tones are 170 hertz apart. Typically it's 2125 hertz and 2295 hertz. Transmits information at 45.45 baud. So you think back to the modem days of dial-up internet and how slow we thought 56K was back in the day. This is not 45K, this is 45 period. So you effectively get about 60 words per minute out of it. Or actually it's probably a little bit less than that. It is basically typing speed for a lot of people is the speed of it. And as I said, it was originally done with teleprinters and evolved as digital technology evolved in the 70s and 80s. There started to be purpose-built boxes for radio teletype and other digital modes that you hook to a dumb terminal or a computer or whatever. Those were pretty much the only two options. But anyway, or I guess a teletype machine. But RIDI, even though this is the oldest digital mode, it is still in use today. It is a little bit threatened at this point by FT4, which we are not going to talk about in this presentation. But RIDI is sort of the traditional DXing and contesting digital mode. It's still used for keyboard-to-keyboard conversations. This is how RIDI is done today by most people. This is a screenshot of software called MMTTY. This uses your sound card to generate the tones and to decode the tones. And you can see it's kind of hard to demonstrate it from just a static screenshot, but if you were to type in that lower window, each character you type is transmitted as you type it if you've got the TX button switched on. The displays over on the right, the display at the top, the spectrum display, you see the two big peaks. That's for the mark and the space frequencies, the two FSK frequencies. And then the display on the right is the classic crossed bananas display. That's the old style of tuning indicator to let you know that you've got a RIDI signal tuned in correctly, because if you're off frequency, if you're not tuned into the right frequency tones, you're not going to decode anything. So what you want is that to make a plus symbol, and if it doesn't, then you need to tune one way or another, or it can mean you've got the wrong shift selected. So now I'm going to play an audio sample of what RIDI sounds like, and what you're actually going to hear are several RIDI signals at once. This is on a busy band during a contest, and you're going to hear, we'll just play it and let you hear for yourself. So those are several RIDI conversations going on at the same time. You hear low tones, high tones, but in each case you hear the warbling sound. Those are the two tones alternating back and forth at 45 baud. All right? So a lot of the digital modes that immediately came after RIDI were improvements on RIDI. The first of those is Amtor, which is actually based on a commercial mode called Cytor. But Amtor added error correction. So if you're operating RIDI, and you're watching your screen and you're hearing a signal and you're seeing the characters print out as it goes, what if all of a sudden there's a big fade and that signal goes down in the noise? Your print either gets garbled or it stops entirely. and sometimes you don't want the print getting garbled. You don't want any ambiguity or any question about what's being sent to creep into your message. So Amtor added error correction to RIDI. However, this was the first digital mode that required a dedicated piece of hardware that had a little intelligence to it beyond just being able to encode and decode. It started in the late 70s, was used pretty heavily up through the 80s, but it's not very common anymore. And the one thing about Amtor back in the day, the one concern about Amtor was you had to have an HF radio that was capable of switching between transmit and receive really quickly if you operated in the ARQ mode, automatic retry request. Because what you'll hear in a minute is a couple of different forms of Amtor. The error correction was accomplished in one of two ways. There was forward error correction, where it sounds a lot like RIDI. You're just transmitting continuously, but you're transmitting each character twice. And then there was ARQ mode, which is a little bit more like packet radio, where you send a burst of data, and then the other station either sends an acknowledge or doesn't. So that's the mode that required switching back and forth rapidly. So here, there's the ARQ mode. Turn that up a little bit. So what you're hearing are two stations there. There's a longer burst and a shorter burst. There's the transmitter and the receiver. Transmitter sending data, the receiver is acknowledging each time, so that's a switch. Each one of those is switching between transmit and receive. It's rapid toggling of the TR relay. And then the other mode in ARQ sounds a lot more like, or FEC sounds a lot more like RIDI, and apparently I left that out of the presentation, but
Sounds like a
you
submarine.
can imagine what it's supposed to sound like. Packet, this is probably something that's a little more familiar to some of you. Packet radio got developed around the same time as Amtor. Based on existing standards, Bell Standards 103 and 202 for telephone modems. But the amateur AX25 protocol was, the early forms of that started being developed in the late 70s, and it's still used today, not as much on HF as it once was, but on VHF. It's still really common on 2 meters, and actually right here we're operating packet right here on 144.39 with APRS. So it's an AFSK mode. Again, it's 2 tones, a mark, and a space frequency. And here's what 1200 baud packet sounds like. Most of you probably heard it before. So you notice it really doesn't sound like 2 tones. It just sounds like a noise. It's because they're toggling back and forth so fast, it just kind of melts into one noise. So that packet was used, being higher speed, it was and is useful for transmitting a lot longer messages, exchanging files and things like that. Pactor came along in the 80s. It's a set of proprietary digital modes that improve upon RIDI and HF packet. Pactor 1 was an open standard. Pactor 2 and 3 are not open standards, and you have to buy a modem from one specific company called SCS to be able to use it. But it's supposed to be more robust on HF to allow you to exchange more data more reliably. And here's what Pactor sounds like. Sounds a little bit like 300 baud packet if I had a sample of that. But it's a little bit more like Amtor in that you have the quick acknowledge. Alright, so moving more now into more modern times, the first of what were referred to at the time as the sound card modes was PSK31. This was one of the first amateur radio digital modes, other than maybe radio teletype, that didn't require you to go buy a TNC or a terminal unit or some other kind of hardware just to operate that digital mode. You could take your computer, use the sound card in your computer with the line-in jack and the line-out, or line-in or microphone jack, line-out or speaker jack, hook it to your radio, and operate this digital mode. It became very popular very quickly. A lot of people thought it would do away with RTTY. It didn't. But it's still a very popular keyboard-to-keyboard mode. 14070 has activity on it almost all the time. I guess on 40 meters, is it 7070 on 40 meters? And there are a few other watering holes for PSK31 activity, but 14070, there's PSK31 activity very often on there. And here's what PSK, the PSK part again is phase shift keying, so you're going to hear one tone, but you're going to hear the phase reversals in it, and it has a very distinctive warbling sound. So notice it's just a solid 1 kilohertz tone, but with phase reversals ever so often to actually create the data. All right, and then the next, one of the next sound card modes, MFSK16. Now, this is a mode that has never really been all that popular or in wide use, but this is what's going to lead us up to start really leading us up to FT8. So, developed in 1999, it uses 16 tones spread out over 316 hertz. It spawned a number of other MFSK modes that are similar, but were designed to work under different circumstances for certain purposes. So here's what MFSK 16 sounds like. So you notice it uses many more tones. It almost sounds like some of the pager type tones that use more than one tone. All right? So what do we use all of these modes for? Well, I've mentioned a number of uses as we've gone along. Keyboard-to-keyboard conversations, storing and forwarding messages in the case of PACTOR. WinLink is an HF to email gateway using typically PACTOR. I think now there's some of that, what is it, Q15X25 or whatever it's called. Anyway, it's another MFSK mode that's not proprietary, but there are a number of digital modes that are suited for doing those sorts of things, and they're also useful for transmitting information already digitized. If you have a computer file and you want to send it to somebody over the radio, you can do it with the digital mode. Of course, there aren't many digital modes that will allow you to send large files, but small files you could do. All right. So those aren't the only uses of digital modes. So the other one, and the one that we're most interested in for FT8's purposes, are, so in addition to keyboard-to-keyboard messages and what was the other one that I mentioned? Keyboard-to-keyboard messages and transmitting digitized information. There's also making contacts under conditions unsuitable for traditional analog modes. Voice emissions require a certain signal-to-noise ratio for you to be able to get something intelligible out of it. Voice typically requires 0 dB SNR or greater. CW is, if you have really good hearing and you're a really well-seasoned CW operator, you might be able to decode Morse code down to minus 10 dB below the noise level. But we can do better with digital modes. It's not just weak signal situations either. It's also situations where precise transmission of data is required. And if you've ever listened to the W1AW Field Day Bulletin, which I think we did at the GOTA station last year, it's really hard to copy. The guy reading out the W1AW Bulletin over single sideband with fading and noise and everything else, it is hard to catch it all. But with RTTY or CW, you get precise information. You get each letter one by one. So that's one situation where this advantage of digital modes applies. Any kind of message, email, NTS traffic. APRS leverages digital to transmit position so that the stations who are monitoring get your accurate position. But weak signal situations are where FT8 really shines. Situations where the propagation's poor, the band conditions aren't good, you're using a radio in a basement with a coiled up antenna, things like that. VHF bands where weak signals, way of life, moon bounce, meteor scatter, those are all situations where digital modes are leveraged to take advantage of their abilities to work under low signal to noise ratios. So, in 2001, a software package was released called WSJT, that stands for Weak Signal Joe Taylor. Joe Taylor's K1JT, he was the author. He's a Nobel Prize in Physics winner from Princeton University. But he's a very avid amateur radio operator, and he's very active on 6 meters every summer. So he's not just an active, he's not just the author, he's also a user. He created the software and the modes specifically for specialized VHF operations, originally meteor scatter and moon bounce. The thing that is unique about WSJT is it draws from traditional meteor scatter protocol and moon bounce protocol, where stations transmit in very specific time slots. One station transmits for 15 or 30 seconds, the other station transmits for 15 or 30 seconds. The software is intended to work the same way. So it's not like the other modes where you can start transmitting, you transmit your message, and then you stop, then the other station starts transmitting, they transmit their message, then they stop. It's you transmit for a period of time, you stop, the other station decodes it, and then they transmit on that time bound. 10 slides to go, Kim, just so you know. So the original mode that was created for meteor scatter was FSK 441, and as I was explaining earlier, it says FSK, technically it's MFSK because it used 4 tone frequencies, but we'll call it 4FSK. And the principle of FSK 441 is I have a really super short message that's maybe 15 characters long that I want to transmit as many times as possible in my transmit window, so that when I get that meteor burn that gives me a ½ second of propagation, my message will get through at least once. So that's the way it works. It sends, a couple of call signs in a grid square or an exchange or whatever over and over and over at very high speed. So you have to have a pretty decent signal to be able to decode it because it uses a lot of bandwidth. But if you get that meteor burn and all of a sudden you've got something to bounce your signal off of and it plops into the other guy's receiver, then you've accomplished what you want. It's only used on 6 meters and up because actually it could technically be used on 10 meters, but it uses too much bandwidth for HF. Remember the rule, it had the symbol rate rule, because it's 441 baud, it's not legal on HF. Actually it may be now, but at the time it wasn't. And then the other mode that was introduced was for moon bounce, and it's called JT44. JT44 is kind of the polar opposite. The idea of JT44 is it's extremely slow. You're still transmitting a short message, but this time you're only transmitting it once, and you're taking as little bandwidth as possible, because with moon bounce, your signal doesn't necessarily come and go, it's just extremely weak. So with JT44, it was 30-second intervals, just like FSK 441, but it uses 44 different tones, and instead of transmitting at 441 baud, 5 baud. So very, very slow. And I'll actually demonstrate that. Both of these modes are now obsolete. However, actually you can still get WSJT to operate FSK 441, but nobody really operates it. So what I'm going to do is load an old version from 2002 of the WSJT software. So this is one of the very early versions of WSJT. And I'll put it in FSK 441 mode first. And I'm just going to, whatever message is already in here, we'll go with that. I'll tell it to transmit, and when my transmit period rolls around, you'll hear, hopefully, if it works, what it sounds like. So it ought to start right at the top of the minute. Let's see if it does. Yep. Although it's not coming out. Why is it not coming out? Well, it acted like it was. No, it didn't. Actually, didn't transmit. Oh,
Select a message.
I didn't tell it to send. Oh, it's actually grayed out. Why is it grayed out? Okay. Well, I'm not going to belabor this too much. I'm just see what's going on. It may not like the HDMI audio. Let's see. So I say send one. Oh, there we go. So you see it has kind of a repetitive sound to it. That's the same message being transmitted over and over. Okay? And I know Roy is wanting me to do my impression, but I'm not going to. And then GT44, by comparison, do auto period on, and we have to wait 30 seconds for that to roll around. But you'll actually hear the 44 different tones. You'll hear it keep going back to one tone. It'll play one tone more than it does the others. That's a sync tone. That's so that the receiver can synchronize to that tone and know that all the other tones should be in specific places up above that. So let's see if this works. Starting now. So that's GT44. All right. So let's get back to. So from there, Joe continued to develop the software and the modes. It wasn't too long before GT44 was replaced by a protocol called GT65. Who in here has heard of GT65? 1, 2, 3.
Tech class.
There probably is something about it in the tech pool. GT65 is similar to GT44, but it's a refinement. It uses 65 tones that. You noticed how those tones seem, that I played a minute ago, kind of sounded like they're all over the place. GT44 squishes those together, that's a technical term, squishes those together and uses less bandwidth, which means they can be decoded down to a lower signal-to-noise ratio. He actually lengthened the time slots to 60 seconds. Again, that helped with the SNR because the tones don't change as frequently. It became very popular on 6 meters, and not long after, and this was mid-2000s when it was introduced, mid to late 2000s. It got very popular on 6 very quickly, and then it started to migrate to the HF bands. Now that was not Joe Taylor's intention. He invented it specifically for moonbounds, but then it got used for sporadic E and other things on 6 meters, and then some people picked it up and said, let's try it on HF. And it really became popular for just making short contacts on HF. But it's fairly inefficient because it takes 4 to 6 minutes to make a conversation, or to make a QSO, when you take 1 minute to call CQ, 2nd minute for somebody to answer you, 3rd minute for you to send a signal report, 4th minute for them to say Roger, 5th minute for you to say 73, and 6th minute for them to say 73, and at the end of it you've taken 6 minutes to exchange 2 numbers. So, and I guess a grid square too. But here's what GT65 sounds like. We'll pull up the modern WSGTX and do GT65 and call CQ and go. We'll take it off TX first. Notice that the tones are slower and they're closer together. Okay? And of course that will go on the rest of the minute. I'll spare you. I'll go ahead while I'm here. The next slide, there was also a mode that he developed called GT9, And it's very similar to JT65, except it pushes the tones farther together still, and in fact, it's almost hard to tell the difference between the tones by ear, and that has, again, the narrower bandwidth results in the ability to copy it at a lower signal to noise ratio. So notice it really sounds like one tone that you're just every once in a while deviating from. But the protocol is otherwise about the same as JT65. Okay?
1200 is the baud rate maximum on 10 meters and above.
Right.
On 10 meters. Below 28 megahertz, it's still 300 is the max.
Yeah, but there's also, so not to get too derailed, but there's this debate over baud rate versus symbol rate.
Right.
So like with Pactor, yeah, Pactor may be less than 300 baud, but because it uses a constellation of tone frequencies and phases, the symbol rate is much higher. Okay, so now we arrive at WSJTX. WSJTX stands for WSJT Experimental. And this is where WSJT always had a reputation for being not very user-friendly, requiring some technical expertise to set up and use. WSJTX it dealt with some of those concerns. So in the summer of 2016, a mode was added to WSJTX called MSK144. Not to be confused with FSK441, which is what it replaced. It's a new meteor scatter mode using 2 FSK at 2000 baud and using 15-second intervals. This mode took over meteor scatter operation, and you can hear it every single morning if you have a decent 6-meter antenna on 50.260. Of course, you're not going to, unless a local transmits, like me, you're not going to hear a continuous signal, but you'll hear bursts of it as meteors pass through. So here's what MSK144 sounds like. Now recall what FSK441 sounded like. Here's MSK144. And I have to tell it that we're not doing field day now. So let me do that really quickly. I'd minimize the presentation. I'll pull this over so you can see. So notice this, it's similar to the software that I showed you a minute ago, but it's a little bit more refined. So now if I hit CQ and enable, see it's similar to FSK441. It's got a little harsher sound to it because of the higher data rate. Alright, so that, like I say, that's literally used every single morning on 6 meters. There's a group of stations that operate meteor scatter and work each other, work new stations as they come along, and it's a great way to work close-in grid squares on 6 meters. Alright, so back to the presentation.
What do you consider close in, Chris?
Good question. So close in, I've defined as greater than ground wave, closer than sporadic E. 300 miles, 300 to 400 miles is sometimes even shorter than that. I've made meteor scatter QSOs that actually use meteor scatter about 200 miles away. So 200 to 400 miles is a really good mode for that. All right. So the advantages of WSJTX over WSJT are that the software does a lot of the work for you. And you were saying all that, or somebody was saying that's cheating if you let it call CQ for you. It'll make the QSO for you. But there's a reason why it's automated. It's because it's so fast with the 15-second intervals. If you weren't just really quick on the mouse and you started transmitting too late, you would not get enough of your message in the 15 seconds for it to be decoded. So it kind of has to be automatic. The 15-second time slots of the new modes are much more practical in situations where you have fading, short-lived openings, that sort of thing. It's just so much quicker than, instead of 6 minutes to make a QSO, now you can make a QSO in a minute.
Where does the time sync come from?
I'll mention that here in a minute. But that's a very good question that most people would not think about, and sometimes I forget about. FT8, which I've kind of put the cart before the horse here, but FT8, which was introduced in July of 2017, very quickly became the #1 digital mode on HF. By the fall, it had overtaken GT65, everything else for routine operation on HF. It started out really designed as a 6-meter mode. Multi-hop sporadic E is what Joe Taylor had in mind for FT8 when he developed it. Has completely revolutionized 6-meter operation, and it spread to HF much quicker than GT65 did. GT65 was a gradual move on the HF. FT8 just immediately replaced GT65. FT8, I actually should have split this slide up, kind of messed that up. I was in a hurry today trying to finish this. 50 hertz of bandwidth, it's 8 FSK, that's what the 8 means. The specifications say it's good to 21 dB below the noise. I occasionally see a message decode at all the way down to 24, but it's unreliable at that low of SNR. Alright, so to Ken's point, because of this very regimented sequence, you only have 15 seconds and you've got to start transmitting as soon as that time starts. The timing's critical. Your computer clock really needs to be accurate to within 1 second of missed or whatever time. So the way that digital mode operators handle that a lot of times is they download an SMTP client such as Dimension 4. Dimension 4 is a free piece of software that will synchronize your computer clock about every 15 minutes. So if your computer clock tends to drift, as most computer clocks do, you know, they'll gain a second or lose a second every day or two or more often, Dimension 4 will correct that. So with FT8, as with GT65 and GT44, the software is going to listen to everything that the receiver can hear. Even though each signal only takes up 50 hertz, it's going to listen to the 2.8 kilohertz or whatever the receiver is passing, and it'll decode everything in that window, which means you can have multiple contacts going on the same frequency at the same time. So the transmissions take 12.64 out of the 15 seconds. In the remaining almost 2.5 seconds, the software then goes through and decodes everything that it heard, and it pops all the messages up on the screen. CQs are highlighted in green, transmitted messages are highlighted in yellow. In the window that I'm talking about, this is, do this. No, that's not at all what I wanted to do. Just skip for a second. Well, we'll see it in the video. I've got about a 9-minute video, a demo that I want to show, but where did my mouse? There it is. Okay. And there's also so the way that you operate it is if you're looking for somebody to work in your receive window, you get a green highlight, CQ call sign grid square. You double click on that and the software will prepare to answer them. You generally want to do that quickly because they've transmitted, you've decoded them in that 2.5 seconds, and if you're going to start transmitting to them, you've got 2.5 seconds to double click on them. But in reality, you can be a little bit late and get enough of the message through and it'll still work. If you're more than about 4 or 5 seconds late, you'll just have to wait until the next time rolls around and hope that nobody else was quicker than you were to the draw. And then the call first checkbox, if it's checked in the software and you call CQ, you're going to transmit your CQ. If someone answers you, the software will then engage them in a QSO without your intervention. It'll pick somebody to work that has called you, and it will do the rest. It will sequence through the rest by itself. What is this sequence? What is this protocol? So, like I say, it's kind of like if you have seen my field day operating presentation, what are the 2 modes of contest operation? Somewhat. is one, search and pounce, and what's the other? Running, or calling CQ. So the CQ format is generally, like I said, CQ call sign grid square, CQ NV4B, Echo Max 64. You can do a directional CQ or a specific CQ. You can add in a DX, I want to call CQ DX, only stations outside the US. I want to work somebody in California, CQ California, or CQ Field Aid. And we'll see that here in a minute. So if, let's say W3AO wants to answer me, he's going to send, if I'm W4JMB and I've called CQ, he's going to send W4JMB, W3AO, FM29. That's his grid square. And so I receive that. If I have call first checked and he's the only one who called me, then my software is going to turn around and send W3AO, W4JMB minus 06 for example. Well, what is minus 06? What does that mean? That is his signal report in signal to dB dB signal to noise ratio. It could be minus or plus, either one. But you know, in this case, let's say they've got a fairly moderately strong signal, and the software determines that they're minus 6 dB. Then we're going to put minus 06 in for their signal report. If they get it, oh, I made a mistake here, didn't I? If W3AO receives the exchange, they reply with R plus the report. That should say W4JNB, W3AO, R minus 02, not the other way around. Again, I was in a big hurry. But the R means Roger, received, and then the O minus 02 is what they're receiving me at. So
That's all
then,
generated by the software.
by the software. And then my software is going to turn around. If I get that R minus 02, I'm going to say W3AO, W4JNB, RR73, Roger, Roger 73. And originally, RR and 73 were separate messages. There'd be an RRR message that would be sent. Then the other station would send 73, then you would send 73. It's just much more efficient to say RR73. It really serves no purpose to break that out. And then he can, if he wants, send W4JNB, W3AO 73. That lets me know he got the RR73 and we're in each other's line. Okay?
And Chris, is minus 02 stronger than minus 06?
Yes, it is. So yeah, and plus something is even stronger than that. So what happens if there's a fade, or there's QRM, or there's something that interferes with one of the messages? Well, the software will stay on whatever phase of the QSO it was on until it receives the correct message to go to the next one. I'm going to call CQ W4JMB EM64, W4JMB W3AO FM29. Then I'm going to send him his signal report. He didn't get his signal report. He calls me again, W4JMB W3AO FM29. That lets me know that he didn't see me the first time. So I'm going to send him his signal report again. The next time he gets it, W4JMB W3AO R minus 22. That tells me that I'm weak. That's why there's going to be some repeats. W3AO W4JMB. So I get the R minus 22. I send the RR73. He sends back R minus 22. He didn't get the RR73. He's still on R minus 22. I send it again. Then he gets it. Then he sends 73. If you're operating FT8 on 6 meters, and you're operating sporadic E where the band comes and goes, you may have to repeat the same message 4 or 5 times and wait for somebody to come back. So there's a little bit of patience involved. If you just don't do anything, if a QSO gets stalled out and you're transmitting, same message over and over and over and over and over, and you're stuck, eventually there's a watchdog timer that's going to fire at 6 minutes. If you don't click on anything or you don't type anything in 6 minutes, it's going to stop transmitting, and then you have to manually tell it to start transmitting again. And then at that time, you might want to go back. You'll probably want to go back to calling the CQ at that point if you've been trying to make a QSO. Usually, you'll want to give up after maybe 3, 4, 5 repeats at the absolute most. All right. And then the last slide that I have here from Ken. So each band on HF has, by a gentleman's agreement, a designated FT8 frequency. It's always upper sideband, even on 40 and 80 meters. And the way you choose you dial up, like on 40 meters over there, we're on 7074. That's the FT8 frequency on 40 meters. You dial up 7074 upper sideband, and you get a waterfall display. The waterfall display, I can go ahead and dump out of this, and we'll see it here in the video. That is not the waterfall display, that is fast graph. Let's do waterfall. Come over here. Let's do view waterfall. So, this is the waterfall display that you'll get. And what this is, you got this is a three-dimensional graph. The vertical axis is time. As time goes on, it shifts farther and farther down, hence waterfall. The horizontal axis is tone frequency, going from 0 to, you can make it as wide up to about 3,000, but you really don't want to go above 3,000 because your sideband filter in your rig is going to cut off anything above about 2,800. And then the brightness of the yellow represents signal strength. The background noise will tend to be blue or black, and signals will start to pop out yellow, and as they get louder, they'll turn red, and that allows you to locate a signal. You notice there's a little red and a little green marker up there. Let me change that to 3 bins per pixel, and it'll be a little bit easier to read. Yeah, well, it said it was. What mode? I'm in MSK 144 mode. That's the problem. Put it in FT8. Okay, now I have to go back over here. Oop, not that. That. Oop, that was it too. Okay, so now you notice there's a bracket, like a yellow, or a red and a green bracket on top. The red signifies the slot in which, the 50 hertz slot in which you will transmit. The green specifies receive, and you actually, again, you receive everything as long as you have the monitor button clicked on there. But if you want to QSO with someone and you double click on them in the band activity menu where all the things are being printed out, then just that one signal that you want to listen to, those messages will start popping up over on the right side. And anything that I transmit will be on the right side as well. Okay, so now I'd like to show this is about a 9-minute video. We recorded this last night at Gary and Mary Jo's using Gary's ICOM 7000, that's the go-to rig. And actually that entire setup right there is what we used. And this was kind of done on a whim, and it's amazing that it worked. But this is a G5RV antenna that is brand new out of the box and hasn't even been uncoiled. So for all intents and purposes, this is no antenna, right? So while we've been sitting here tonight, we've been listening to 40 meters, and just in the last minute, we've heard about 7 or 8 different stations on 40 meter FT8. And you can hear the signals there. They're all fairly high pitched, and we can look in the waterfall and see that there's one at about 2300 hertz, one at about 1775 hertz.